Good evening. I'm Antony Davies at Duquesne University. I'm here with James Harrigan, Senior Research Fellow at Strata in Logan, Utah. And we're here to talk about the federal debt.
Good to see you again, Anthony.
James, it's nice to see you as well. We're here at the right time. The federal debt is scheduled to hit about $20 trillion any day now. It fluctuates up and down a bit, but it's been coming very close to the 20 trillion mark. I would expect, within the matter of days or maybe a week or two.
And we should probably start by talking about how $20 trillion isn't the actual number, it's the stated number. It's the number that the government wants you to think about when you think about the federal debt. But the actual number is much, much higher, conservatively estimated at about $120 trillion.
$120 trillion, that includes not just the official debt, which is $20 trillion, but unfunded liabilities. This is money the federal government has promised to pay largely to retirees, but which it's interestingly not legally obligated to pay. So there's that money. There's also another $15 trillion in state and local official debt and unfunded obligations. So when you put the whole thing together, the entire governmental structure in the United States owes or has promised to pay and does not have the money to pay about $135 trillion.
And we should probably make this worse, not better, because when you start dealing with figures this high, it becomes fabulously difficult to estimate well how big the number actually is. And some estimates have it over $200 trillion.
Yeah, the numbers we're quoting are the conservative numbers. But at $135 trillion, so to put that in perspective, the federal government pays right now about 2.5% interest on its debt. So take 2.5% times the, talk about the federal government, the $120 trillion that the federal government owes, and the annual interest payments on that are now roughly equal to the entire amount of money the federal government takes in a year from all taxes, fees, tariffs combined. So that's a very long window saying federal government right now.
And we could probably speak to that a little more, given some projections that we were able to get through just this afternoon. This
comes from the Congressional Budget Office. They came out with, they come out periodically with projections as to future tax revenues and federal spending and debt levels, going out 10 years into the future. And James and I are actually working on an op-ed on this topic. And as part of that, I was looking up their latest report, which came out last week. And in this report, the Congressional Budget Office projects that the federal government will owe $30 trillion by 2027. So that's in 10 years' time. Now, what's interesting about this number, the $30 trillion, is the Congressional Budget Office historically understates its projections of future debt. And when you're talking about 10 years out, it's typically off by a factor of 2 to 3. So when you do all the math, what happens is actually, if you take the CBO's numbers and adjust for the CBO's historic bias, the actual federal debt we'll be looking at in 2027 is probably closer to 75 trillion.
And 75 trillion actually, in relation to the budget, is where it starts to get truly fascinating.
Yeah, the federal government collects about $3 trillion, maybe $3.5 trillion a year in tax revenues. So, and of course, it spends all of that. But even if it didn't spend that, even if it collected $3 to $3.5 trillion and just used it to pay down the interest on the debt, there's still not enough money.
No, and we're fast approaching a time when the interest on the debt will exceed the federal budget.
Yes.
And when that happens,
we have a question.
All bets are off.
We have a question from Blake Martin asking, will President Trump cut even a little spending? And my answer is, even if he did, a little spending doesn't do anything to fix this problem, you need to cut a lot of spending. And by a lot, I mean something in the neighborhood of 50%, maybe 30% of federal spending. And by cut, I mean actually cut, not what politicians mean when they say cut, which is a lesser increase than the one they actually want.
Yeah, no, and I think we have to consider what happens in a Trump administration on both the spending side on the one hand and on the side of receipts on the other. And if he's successful in getting his protectionist policies off the ground, receipts, I suspect, are going down. So we're going to have a problem on both sides of the coin as we move forward here. Another thing we should probably address in kind of the sober light of day is that presidents don't act in a vacuum. This is going to require a president and a Congress to be on the same page to decide that this is a problem, which is historically something they have a lot of trouble deciding. And then once deciding it's a problem, deciding that we're going to do something about it, which if they can decide that first thing, they've certainly never decided that second thing.
Right.
And we have to ask the question, excuse me, does the political will exist in this country to address this problem before it does unbelievable harm to the economy, the monetary system, and indeed the United States itself?
Yeah, and that leads into Jeff Sindron asks a question: what happens when the federal government defaults on its debt? And to start with, the federal government will never admit to a default, right? What you will get is a default in fact, not a default in word. So my guess is that the first steps to this look like the following. Congress at some point, likely in the next few years, starts to means test Social Security. So basically what it does is it says, all you retirees, you paid in Social Security, but you all don't need it. And those of you that don't need it now aren't going to get it. Now that sounds all very nice and egalitarian. We're not going to be spending money on people who don't need it. But in fact, what's going on is the federal government is defaulting on its promised payments.
And it gets a little worse than that, right? Because another form of default would be monetization of the debt, right? Where the Fed simply prints more money and more money and more money, a habit it's been in for quite some time. But you can see where this would ramp up significantly as things become more dire. And as the Fed prints more money, all of the money in the money supply becomes progressively more worthless. So everybody's money is worth a little less with every additional dollar that's printed. And this, has the net effect of allowing the government to say, yes, we're paying off the debt, but it would be paying off the debt if indeed it even paid off the debt. It hasn't heretofore. But it would be doing so with inflated, progressively more worthless dollars.
Yeah, and this is worth underlining. It's something I think people know enough to repeat the words, but I don't think they really appreciate the truth of the statement. And the statement is this: as the Federal Reserve prints dollars, it has the exact same effect on all Americans as if the federal government reached in and took out of your bank account, out of your savings account, out of your retirement, out of your pocket, some fraction of your money. So, for example, if the Federal Reserve increases the money supply enough to reduce the value of the dollar 10%, you get the same exact effect as if the federal government had just confiscated 10% of all your money.
And this bears repeating yet a third time, because when that happens, think about what happens. People who have behaved responsibly and have saved for their own lives, their own retirements, things like this, those are the very people who will be harmed the most. Who will be helped? Debtors. People who have gone way out on every limb in their lives, people who have behaved irresponsibly. And I think people don't realize just how deep these repercussions will be felt.
There's an interesting question here from Matt Moore. He says, how long would it take to pay back the debt and not severely damage the economy?
Well, it's that second part.
What's interesting about this question, right, the not severely damage the economy is the problem, right? I think, honestly, the right answer to that is somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 to 300 years. And I'm not exaggerating. I mean that quite seriously, 1 to 300 years. The amount of money we're talking about is gargantuan. Now, having said all of that, the federal government doesn't need to pay off its debt, right? It's the same as if you have a credit card, you don't have to pay off the balance of your credit card. All you have to do is be able to afford the minimum monthly payment. So too with the federal government. All it needs to do is be able to afford the minimum monthly payment. The problem is the debt has become so large that that itself is now becoming a problem.
Yeah, no, if our math is correct and the assumptions of the Congressional Budget Office are anywhere near right, given their historical performance, right, and the adjustments we can make to those predictions that come out of that office, we are arriving at the place very soon where we won't be able to service the debt any longer. So yes, right now we can pay the interest on the debt and never the debt. Right? And this bears repeating: we can pay the interest on the debt, but never the debt. So it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger over time. We're quickly approaching a situation in which we will be able to do neither. We won't be able to pay the interest anymore. And when we can't pay the interest anymore, certainly we won't pay down the debt in the least. And this is where we find ourselves. So when Anthony says something like 100 years, that's actually what he means. But we should probably provide at least a ray of hope here, because in a couple of places we've written now about how we could, in fact, balance the budget, not pay the debt, but balance the budget. And maybe you'd like to talk about that. I think it answers another question that was asked somewhere along the way.
Yeah. So the trick here is, the problem is for decades, our federal government has been about 6 years beyond the economy. And what I mean by that is the government, the federal government we have today, we won't be able to afford for another 6 years. And the economy, how do I want to say this? The federal government we have today, we're not going to be able to afford for another 6 years. The economy today is large enough to support the federal government as it existed 6 years ago. So for decades, there's been this 6-year time gap between what the federal government is doing and what the economy is capable of sustaining. So what that means is the trick to balancing the budget is to effectively put the federal government in stasis for 6 years. For 6 years, don't increase federal spending at all, not even for inflation. Hold it absolutely still. And for those 6 years, what happens is the economy starts to grow. And as it grows, we eventually reach a point about 6 years from now where the economy is large enough to sustain the government that we have. From that point forward, you can grow the government, but you can't grow it faster than the economy, something that's been going on for far too long.
Yeah, Eric Lima asks what we would advise cutting, something to this effect. And Ant and I have traditionally not gotten into that game. We don't pick things out and say this should be cut and that shouldn't be. We try to depoliticize this as much as we can and just look at it in a nuts and bolts sort of way. That said, you know, when Ant says we have to make these cuts across the board, you should think about what that actually means. Because what we're really saying is, well, Social Security is going to have to get cut because Social Security is part of everything. And it doesn't have to be a uniform 10%, right? If for whatever the reason Congress decides that Social Security is more valuable than defense spending for whatever reasons it's got, well, that's fine. From our perspective, it's the total number that needs to get cut, right? So we can have political determinations within this total number to determine that which we want to keep at current levels, that which we want to cut 10% or what have you. But the total number has to be held in stasis for 6 years in order for us to catch up with what we can actually afford. And I like to say this a lot. I'm pretty sure nobody actually listens, but I'm going to say it again just for the heck of it. We begin typically in the United States by asking, what do we want? And then we allocate funds to satisfy that desire. We should, in fact, begin instead with the question, what can we afford? The way a household would ask that basic question. We have this much money coming in, what can we afford? And then allocating money given that constraint. But we approach things very typically in the United States in a budgetary manner from a perspective of our wants and not possibilities. And if we inverted that, we'd be far, far better off.
Edgar Rodriguez asks, did President Obama make it worse? Well, the answer is yes, but the answer is also yes to President Bush and yes to, in lesser extent, but yes to President Clinton, yes to the first President Bush, yes to President Reagan, yes to Carter. They all made it worse, right? Not one any more than the other.
All the way back to Eisenhower.
Right, yes. Yeah, the last time we had a balanced budget in this country, now people sometimes say we had balanced budgets under Clinton. Technically, that's not correct. The reason you get the answer balanced budgets under Clinton is if you count money the federal government withdrew from the Social Security Trust Fund, if you count that as revenue, which is akin to you going to an ATM, taking a cash advance on your credit card and saying that's income, right? So if you don't do that, what you find is actually we haven't had a balanced budget since Eisenhower. Now, give President Clinton his due. He came closer than any modern president to balancing the budget, but we actually haven't had it balanced since 1952.
The only way that you can contend that Clinton balanced the budget is if we have absolutely no intention of paying back the money to Social Security recipients. If that's true, then yes, the budget was balanced. But if we intend to pay that money to the people to whom it has been promised, then no, we had deficits then and the debt was run up further as well.
It's worth underlining here because we frequently get into the weeds of, well, should we cut this or that, or what cuts do you recommend? And James is absolutely right. We don't recommend particular cuts, but also we have the benefit of the numbers on our side here. We don't need to recommend particular cuts because if you start asking what particular cuts, you're actually not even asking the right question. The numbers are way too large to ask what particular cuts. Let me give you some perspective. To balance the budget today, you would have to do something like shut down everything the federal government does, with the exception of Social Security, Medicare, interest on the debt, maybe some welfare programs. Other than that, shut down all of it. Then you get a balanced budget.
Yeah, maybe you should point out, there's a story that Ant often tells when we speak publicly on these things. And it was about the midnight basketball programs. Do you remember this?
Yes, right. So this was back in President Obama's first term, I believe, and this was round about March, and there was some discussion, a lot of discussion about balancing the budget. So the president suggested cutting $300 million in community block grants. And there was much to do about this. People on one side saying, well, we have to balance the budget, so let's make this is $300 million in cuts. And people on the other side saying, no, we can't cut this because, this is money going to the poorest Americans. We have to leave it in, cut something else. So as a country, we spent, the better part of 6 weeks in the news going back and forth about whether or not to cut this $300 million. Now, that sounds like a heck of a lot of money, $300 million. The fact is the federal government blows through that much money every 45 minutes. So what was going on is we were spending more time talking about the problem than what the solution was worth. And this is often something that politicians will hide behind, politicians on both sides, which is they will say large numbers like this. We're going to cut $1 billion from the budget. Oh my God, $1 billion. The government spends $11 billion a day, right? They'll hide behind the large numbers. And you hear them and you don't realize that the problem is so huge that those numbers actually are meaningless.
We've got an interesting question here, a couple, but they're deeply related, from Jeff Cintron, who asks, first, could we become like Venezuela? And second, will my savings become worthless? It's interesting because you and I have been doing some research and we've written on Venezuela a couple of times in the past few months now. And the short answer to that question is yes, absolutely. We could become like Venezuela.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah. And will your savings become worthless? Yeah, that the answer is there is also quite possibly yes.
Yeah, quite possibly. And then, you have to make some determinations in your own life how you will behave in terms of savings and investments and things like this, given what might happen and what's likely to happen, which, probably two very different things.
Frank C. asks, do you believe current and former members of Congress are ignorant to this, or are they pushing their own or others' prerogatives? My guess is, I don't know this firsthand, but my guess is, generally speaking, no, Congress is not ignorant of this. The problem isn't Congress. The problem is the voters. Congress will respond to the voters. And what you've got right now is a small number of voters who realize this is a problem, we need to do something, and a large number of voters who say we have our own problems, and if the government would just spend some more money, it would fix it. Now, these guys in Congress are looking to get elected. So in a sense, it doesn't matter what they know. What matters is what we, the voters, know. And if we, the voters, aren't aware this is a problem, then the congressmen who say, yes, I'll increase spending, those are the ones who are going to get elected.
Yeah, the United States has always been very, very good at solving short-term problems. Problems that appear in the very near term get everyone's full attention and tend to get solved pretty well. The long-term problems, things that it's possible to kick down the road past an election cycle or past 2 or 3 or 30 election cycles, those problems don't get solved all that well. We do just what you might expect. We wait until they hit crisis levels, and then we turn our attention to them. But the problem here is that the long-term problem has become so profound that when it becomes a short-term problem, we'll never be able to solve it. This is the kind of problem that we absolutely need to solve over the long term, over the next 100 years. And American politics don't react well to 100-year time horizons. They react very well to 2-year time horizons, which not insignificantly is the amount of time a sitting House member has until he's up for re-election.
Matt Moore asks, at what point in time do you think we would start defaulting on the debt? The interesting answer to that question is, I can tell you exactly, 1985. In 1985, Congress altered the Social Security rules. Prior to 1985, Social Security retirement benefits were not taxable. Starting in 1985, Congress retroactively altered the rules so that from that point forward, anyone who receives Social Security, including people who had been receiving it up to that point, owe income tax. That's identical to about a 20%, 15 to 20% default on Social Security benefits. So it's already started.
Yeah, and every instance of inflation is exactly the same animal.
This is off topic, but it's worth mentioning. Jesse Day asks a question about the healthcare system, that we have to fix this thing. And again, it's off topic, so I don't want to spend too much time on this. But I point out anytime someone raises the healthcare issue, that what we did, I think, was the wrong thing. And I'm not talking about Affordable Care Act. I'm talking about the process. We saw a problem, that is rising cost of healthcare. And we asked the question, what can government do to fix this? Rather than asking, what is government currently doing to contribute to the problem? Had we asked that question, we would have come up with a very different set of solutions. I can't claim that these solutions would have fixed the problem, but I do claim they would have gone much further toward fixing it than the solutions we came up with by asking the wrong question, which is, what can government do?
And Aunt Samuel Iloa asks a basic question, and I think it's one that we probably ought to cover. He asks, who are the creditors that the United States owes? And can the U.S. negotiate the debt, something that Trump has claimed he would do, with these creditors?
Yeah, that's a good question, because when we talk about this stuff, people say, well, China, we owe China the money.
Well, but
we do owe China some of the money. Yeah, but not a lot. The bulk of the federal debt is owed to the Social Security Trust Fund. That's about $5 trillion. Now, be careful there, because people will say, well, that doesn't count. That's the government owing itself. That's incorrect. The Social Security Trust Fund is held by the government, but it is held in trust for retirees. That money doesn't belong to the government. It belongs to current and future retirees. That's who the government owes the largest chunk to. About $3 to $5 trillion. Actually, it's closer to 5 trillion if you add in federal workers who are anticipating federal pension benefits, right? So that's the largest chunk. The next largest chunk is owed to American corporations and American people. So, you can, when you were a little kid, you may have received from your grandparents a savings bond, right? And you look at this thing and say, this is $100 savings bond. You're all happy you have $100 until your parents take you aside and say, no, actually you have 35 bucks because it's worth $100 when it matures in 20 years, right? That's that savings bond. That's part of the federal debt. The way you get it is you give the federal government your money. They give you this piece of paper. 20 years you give it back. You get your money back with interest. So the second largest chunk is owed to American people, American corporations. Then comes the Federal Reserve, which is owed about $3 trillion. Then comes foreign governments, foreign corporations, right? So this idea of renegotiating the debt is a non-starter. The best you could do is do something like call up China, who has a large chunk of the debt, about $1 trillion, and say, look, we want to renegotiate this. And China, first off, is not at all going to be happy about that, right? Let's suppose in a perfect world, you can negotiate that down by 50%. You've saved what? $500 billion. That'll fund the federal government for 50 days.
When you start looking at it, everywhere we look, the answer is, well, that's just a drop in the bucket. And that's what happens when the figures get so large and interest does what it does. There's just no way out of this, right? You have to sooner or later say, we owe this much and we have to pay it. And the first step towards paying it is to stop spending more than we have, which by definition stops creating more debt. And that's the lesson that American politicians have such trouble learning, because it's really fun to spend money and give people what they want. It's not a lot of fun to look at people and say, well, your taxes aren't going down, but you're going to get significantly less from this point moving forward. And that's, in fact, what they will have to say to people.
Samuel Lowe asks, what does the government buy every 10 minutes? I don't understand how it can buy 10 billion so quickly. So yeah, let me unpack that a little bit. So the government spends about 10 billion, maybe 11 billion per day. So you work it out per hour. It's like, I don't know what it is, $200, $300 million an hour, right? Something like that. And what's that? That's on all sorts of things, right? It's the military, it's depreciation on buildings and military equipment and stuff the federal government owns. It's upkeep of the federal parks. It's all of the hundreds of thousands of people's salaries who work for the federal government, right? All of this stuff. That's what the federal government's spending this money on.
Hey, it's even the post office.
Right. Yeah, all of this stuff. So every time we say something like, well, the government should, the words that follow should are things that are adding to that sum of money.
Right. And now you could add all manner of healthcare into the mix. It's not that we didn't already do that, right? We had Medicare, Medicaid, Veterans Administration. These are all federal programs. But we add to them and we expand them over time, and money goes out the door. And the money that goes out the door far eclipses the money that comes in.
We've got a question here that goes back to your conversation, James, on the monetization. So Gren McCurley asks, explain what it means when the Federal Reserve monetizes the debt. Sure.
Well, I mean, the simplest explanation to that is that the money in the United States economy, American dollars, are backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. They're not hinged to anything, right? The amount just floats out there, and the Federal Reserve determines how much more will print in any given year, aided and abetted by their friends in Congress and this sort of thing. But when we say monetize the debt, think of it this way. If you owe someone $100, but you have a printing press in your basement, well, you're just going to keep printing money until you don't owe the money anymore, right? Until you're able to pay it off. The downside is when we look at this on a large wholesale endeavor like the United States in the world, when you print too much money, inflation follows, because you've weakened all the dollars that are floating around in circulation by just simply printing more. And when you simply print more, the ones that are out there are worth less, and then people charge more for products because they don't require, say, $30,000 for an automobile. They require $30,000 worth of purchasing power for an automobile. Right? So they're going to increase the price to maintain the degree of purchasing power that they achieve by selling the product at market. And this has the net effect of inflation every single time. That's just what's going to happen. If the Fed prints more money, the money in the circulation will be worth less, and we will get inflation. The question is, how much more money will they print, and how much more inflation will we get? So as the debt level goes up, and they can't pay it off, they can't service the debt, they can't pay the interest, the urge to print more money will be overwhelming, because it will become the only answer left. And when it's the only answer left and they do it, inflation will go through the roof compared to what we've become quite used to. And, people don't remember this, but if you go back just to the Carter administration, I think from the years, what was it, about 77 to 80, the inflation rate was pushing 20%. And now what are we at now in the last 10, 12 years? It's been pretty constant.
Right, about 3%.
So, think about that for a second. 20% inflation in the Carter era. Ouch. People were paying, I believe, 19% on mortgages for a while. So if you wanted to buy a house, you were going to take out a mortgage, a loan, at nearly 20%. Now it's about 3.5 to 4. So these are the fundamental differences. It has the net effect of fixing it so normal people can't afford to buy things like houses when inflation really takes off.
Rosemary Morrissey asks, doesn't debt make the world go round? Individuals, families, and governments all contribute. And the answer to that question is prudent debt does, not imprudent debt, right? So picture the difference between you taking out debt in the form of a student loan to get a college degree in engineering, which you then use to go out and you earn 6 figures as an engineer. Clearly, that's prudent debt, right? Because the benefit that you get from borrowing and then spending that money far exceeds the cost of borrowing it in the first place. Now, think conversely about taking out the same, let's call it $100,000 debt. Take out the same $100,000 debt, but this time don't pay for a college education, pay for multiple trips to Tahiti, right, where you sit in the beach all day and you drink. Clearly, that's imprudent debt, because that debt is not going to generate any future benefit to you, right? It's enjoyable, you're consuming stuff, but you're not you're not building up any value for the future. So the question is debt a good thing? The answer is it depends. Prudent debt is, imprudent debt isn't. Now, the way we determine what is prudent debt is by letting the person who takes on the debt make the decision as to whether or not to take it on, right? So if I've got to take on, I'm thinking about borrowing $10,000, I think to myself, what benefit can I obtain from this $10,000? And I also think to myself, what is it going to cost me, right? Not just in terms of interest, but if I can't pay it back, I'm going to lose my car or my house or whatever. Am I willing to live with the consequences of that borrowing? When the same person has to deal with both the return and the consequences, then you get prudent debt on average. The problem with government debt is that the people making the decision are not the people who have to live with the consequences. The politicians decide whether to borrow more, and if it's imprudent borrowing, it's the taxpayer that has to live with the consequences.
Yeah, in the end, there's investment debt and consumption debt. And for politicians, consumption and investment are often the same thing, because what they invest in is their own reelection, not in the long-term financial health of the country.
I'm looking for some more questions for us, James.
What do you got?
Would it be bad for me to take out, this is Blake Martin, would it be bad for me to take out a student loan? what private sources could look. Okay, the student loan thing, James and I have written on quite a bit. You want to take that one, James?
Yeah,
Would it be
sure.
bad for you to take out student loan?
Sure. I mean, the short answer, well, the long answer, I guess, is it depends. Because some things that you can take a student loan out for are clearly going to benefit you. They're clearly a very, very good investment in your life for the long haul. Other things approach such egregious stupidity that you should never take out a student loan. And the line that Ant and I came up with when we wrote about this first was, a college education is not an investment, a college major is. And come to find out, if you view the loan as an investment, so we're not talking about the value of education as such, right? If you want to go get educated and you're willing to pay for it, by all means, please go do it. But if you're looking at your education as a mechanism by which you will invest in your own future, in your ability to make a living moving forward, what you notice very quickly is that some majors are fantastic investments, fantastic. And it's all of the sciences, right? All of the STEM disciplines, the science, tech disciplines, engineering, mathematics, things like this, economics, come to find out, finance. These are wonderful investments that will almost invariably, if you do your part and achieve the education and do well in so doing, if you do your part, you will recoup all of that money and more. And petroleum engineering is actually the by far and away the best investment you can make. It returns, correct me if I'm wrong, Ant, about $5 million more over the space of a working career than it costs. Now, that's all at the left-hand side of the distribution. If you go to the right-hand side of the distribution, what you find there are the studies majors that we often talk about. So any major ending in the word studies is going to yield a very poor outcome, the poorest of which is family studies, which nets you back roughly over the space of a working career, just about what you paid to get the education. So obviously those sorts of majors aren't worth it at all. And what you find is there's the great mass of careers and majors are in the middle between these two extremes. So, things like the standard liberal arts majors, things like history, politics, philosophy, things like this, pay reasonably well over time. Other things like, where would we be? The fine arts, things like this, pay less well over time. And in these careers, it tends to be the force of the personality of the person who took the loan in the first place. So, you can't draw hard and fast conclusions apart from sciences to the left, studies to the right, and most everything else in between. Choose very, very wisely. If you get in touch with us, we actually have a chart that we can send you with all these majors and the expected return over time. So you can figure out whether this form of debt is worth it for you with maybe a little more information than you would have had otherwise.
Yeah, and it's worth underlining as well that there's far more value to an education than simply what you earn in the marketplace, right? And that's perfectly fine. But usually in the context of this conversation, what we're really discussing is federal support for college education. Right. And if the federal government is going to support the college education, it doesn't matter what the benefit is to the person. What matters is what's the benefit to society. And that benefit, more often than not, is best reflected in the wage rate that the person can earn when the person hits the job market.
Right.
Elijah McIntosh asks to charge more in taxes and get less, as you stated earlier. How much would taxes have to increase to remain able to pay the interest on the current debt? All right, so basically, to balance the budget, by how much would taxes have to rise? And you're catching me off guard, but I can give you a ballpark.
We actually looked at this just recently, right? We can answer this at least at first in a roundabout way when you make calculations on the back of a napkin there, because we did look at first taxing the 1% at 100%. And to do that doesn't even come close to balancing the budget. And then we looked at taxing the top 5% at 100%, and that doesn't come close either. And then we asked the even more difficult question, what if we confiscated all the wealth of these people? And that didn't do it either. Right. So these are the sorts of...
Now, James, now James is talking about paying off the debt. That's absolutely correct. If you want to forget about paying off the debt and do the easier thing and just say, okay, we want our expenses to equal our spending, balance the thing. I think across the board, you're probably looking at something like a 15 percentage point increase. So what that means is if you're currently paying on your federal taxes, let's say 10% of your income, we've got to raise that to 25%. If you're in the upper income levels, you're paying 35%, we're going to have to raise that to 50%. But the interesting thing, which James highlighted, is our fallback position is, well, let's just tax the rich. And that comes about by this thing that people keep repeating, that the rich aren't paying their fair share. If you look at the federal government's numbers, right? This is not my calculation. This is the federal government's numbers. If you look at the federal government's numbers, the average effective tax rate, and by that what I mean is after you've done your deductions and exemptions and tax havens and all of that, after you've done that and the dust settles, how much are you actually paying? The top 1% on average pays about 30% federal taxes. That's all federal taxes combined: income taxes, payroll taxes, tariffs, corporate taxes, all the whole thing, right? So the top 1% pays about 30%. Middle income Americans pay about 7%. The poor pay about 2%. So this thing about the rich not paying their fair share is kind of odd, because on a percentage basis they're actually paying much more. But more than that, if you attempt to raise the taxes on the rich, it turns out you're not going to get much for it. Yeah, you'll get some more tax revenue, but you're not going to get much because they're already being taxed at a very high rate. Where the money lies, I hate to say this, is with the poor and the middle class, the people who actually are paying very little in federal taxes, right? We're talking about federal taxes here. And you could say, well, the poor and the middle class don't earn as much as the rich. That's absolutely right, but they vastly outnumber them. So when you attach a larger tax to those people, all of a sudden you're going to start generating some numbers. I'm not advocating doing that. I'm simply saying if you look at the math, that's how it falls.
Yeah, no, we always end up looking at the middle class because that's the lion's share of the American population. So you have to play a numbers game here. In order to get the receipts you would need to spread the pain over as many citizens and taxpayers as you possibly could. And that gets us well past what we just euphemistically call the rich.
Jesse Day asks, what effect does petrodollar as a world reserve currency have on the buying power of the common U.S. citizen's income? I don't know the answer to that, but it raises an interesting question that James and I have talked about from time to time. It's probably worth mentioning. And I'm going to mention it in the context of Bitcoin, but I'm not talking specifically about Bitcoin. I'm talking about alternative currencies in general. And that is this: the reason a central bank can inflate its currency is because there's no competition for it, right? The same forces of competition that cause businesses to be forced to provide better services at lower quality, those same competitive forces can force a central bank not to inflate its currency. So if you look at banks that inflate their currencies, central banks inflate their currencies. It's in the context of not having competition. So one of the interesting things, and this is where alternative currencies come up, as they become more popular, they're going to present competitive pressure to governments. Right now, possibly not the United States given the size of its economy, but certainly smaller economies, where you get to a situation where you have, take Venezuela as an example. Venezuela starts inflating its dollar. If Venezuela were doing now 10 years from now, inflating its currency, it might have it in the form of something like Bitcoin, enough competition that the people just say, well, fine, we're not using the Bolivar anymore. We're switching to Bitcoin. And that takes away the government's ability to manage its money supply, to monetize its debt.
Not that the Venezuelan government's doing a bang-up job as it is. To put this in perspective, people in Venezuela, can't fit the money they need into standard wallets anymore. You literally can't carry your money with you. And at some points of purchase, they no longer count money, they weigh it because it's become so utterly worthless. So these are the sorts of things going on in Venezuela that allows us to say things like Bitcoin is going to be a competitor, or something like a Bitcoin might well be a competitor to the Bolivar at some point in the not too distant future.
We have a question here about, it's a really good question. I'm hesitating to take it for fear of it taking up a lot of time. Steve Perry asked, do you agree that the concentration of assets in our country, the top 1%, represents a problem? There are two ways that assets can get concentrated in the hands of a small number of people. One way is through coercion. That is, I force you, I take your stuff away from you by force, right? Either I do it directly or I co-opt the government to do it on my behalf. That clearly, concentration of wealth that occurs in that fashion is clearly a bad thing. What's interesting, though, is the other way that wealth can become concentrated. And that is, I come up with some cool idea, right? Oh, I've got this thing. James hates this thing. I have a Star Trek communicator.
For God's sake.
I come up with this thing and I market it and people love it, right? And they love it so much, they're willing to give me their money in exchange for it because they like it better than they like the other things their money could buy. And so what happens over time is I start to accumulate a lot of wealth. But notice the difference. I'm accumulating wealth because I provided something of value to others. When we talk about wealth accumulation, we tend to look at the dollars rather than the goods and services. So think about Steve Jobs, for example. Steve Jobs dies with $8 billion in the bank. And if I ask, how many of you have, billions of dollars, and virtually nobody does, right? Steve Jobs puts his hand up and that's it. And you look and you say, there's tremendous inequality here. This one guy is sitting on all the dollars, nobody else has any. Yeah, but that's only half of the equation. The other half of the equation are those iPhones that he sold in exchange for the dollars. Now, if I ask, how many of you have smartphones? Virtually every hand goes up. Something like 94% of Americans own a smartphone. That's incredible equality. The equality is showing up when you look at the goods and services that are resulting due to the fact that people are handing over willingly their money to these entrepreneurs who are then giving them exchange goods and services. That kind of concentration of wealth is not a problem. In fact, I would encourage you to be careful about how you talk about it, because people will say things like the top 1% control, X% of the wealth. That verb control is wrong. It's the top 1% created X% of the wealth. That's the right use of the verb. And when you think of it like that, all of a sudden concentration of wealth looks like a very different animal.
All right. So Ant just, I think, laid out a case against a number of the claims Piketty makes. Do I have that right? I mean, this is essentially
Sure.
the case against Piketty from the economic perspective. From the political perspective, I think it's subtly different. And here we have to ask other questions, right? So keeping it in terms of Piketty, what does he suggest? Well, he suggests that the government should be empowered to address these problems. And I would say that Ant's reliance on the free market as an answer to the charge is an interesting one, and it's one that Piketty doesn't see, right? Because he breaks exactly the other way on this. But the animal that he's fighting, this oligarchic tendency, right, for a few to control the mechanisms of the state at the expense of others, is mitigated by a free market, but made worse in a condition as the state becomes more and more powerful over time, right? Because what happens in an oligarchy in the first place, people satisfy their own interest and then they move out to a small circle of friends and it stays with this small group. And really, instead of describing a free market, what you're describing is cronyism, which is radically different. And I think all parties can agree, and this is the interesting part, right? All parties can agree that cronyism is a real problem and we really need to deal with that. But the real question becomes, how could we actually deal with that? Right? And that's where the divergence of opinion occurs, because one group typified by Piketty and a host of others, I would say this is a majority opinion, would stress the need for government involvement. We, on the other side, Ant and I are both very free market friendly. We would say from the other side, actually, what you end up with when you enhance the powers of the state is more of the same. So the only correct answer, the only answer that will get you to the place where everybody agrees we want to be, from our perspective, is to limit the authority and power of government in the first place, to where it can't pick winners and losers. Piketty just wants them to pick better winners and losers. We want to say, no, that's not in the proper purview of government in the first instance, for all of the reasons that Ant put forth earlier. But I don't want to understate our shared common understanding that there is, in fact, an issue here. It's just the question of what causes that issue, what perpetuates the issue, and what can address it.
James, there's a question here specifically for you. Jason Tenerovich asks, Dr. Harrigan, do you think there's any chance that this session of Congress will do anything effective to rein in spending and begin the process of paying down the debt?
Absolutely not. I don't think there's any hope of that happening. I wish I could give you a different answer, Jason, and it's good to hear from you. Jason's a former student. I can't see a way, given the current climate, how this president and this Congress will actually rein in spending. And given what I know about human nature and political animals generally, I don't know that I can construct the case in which any president and any Congress, and I'm thinking broadly here in terms of parties and ideologies, it's very difficult to imagine any set of circumstances that would have our elected leaders doing the responsible thing until and unless, and here's the hard part, the American people, the rest of us, actually demanded, knowing full well that we will bear the costs of that approach. And I don't think, I mean, I know for a fact we're not willing to do that as a people. So of course they're not willing to do it as our political leaders.
Dave LaDuca asks, what's the single largest line item on the budget? This is an interesting question because from time to time on Facebook, this meme will go around. It's a pie chart and it shows, this huge chunk that's military spending. And that meme is actually incorrect. That pie chart is showing you only a portion of the federal budget, the portion called discretionary spending, which is actually the smaller of two portions. The other portion is mandatory spending. So if you look at that, the mandatory spending is something like twice the size of the discretionary spending. But nonetheless, to answer your question, the largest line item is Social Security benefits, followed closely by Medicare benefits. Those two things individually are larger than military spending. Either one of them is larger than military spending.
That's been the case for a very long time and will absolutely continue to be the case for the foreseeable future. Until interest on the debt eclipses them.
Right. Samuel Aloha asks, does welfare basic income dissuade people from working? Well, yeah, clearly, there's no question that there's an effect, right? Because if I give you money, there's less money now that you have to earn, so there's a lesser tendency to work, right? Can you point to individuals to whom that rule doesn't apply? Absolutely, you can. But we're talking about a policy that's going to apply to all people. So what matters is not what the individual people do, but what the people do in the aggregate, that is on average. And on average, what you get is as you increase welfare spending, you dissuade people from working. Now, having said that, you can make an argument that under certain circumstances, perhaps it's worth it. Perhaps it's a better outcome that we, to an extent, dissuade people from working in exchange for guaranteeing that everybody has food. Right? And those sorts of questions are well worth asking, but they don't negate the fact that, yes, indeed, if you give people money, you're going to dissuade them to an extent from working.
I mean, the economic truism is a simple one. If you want more of something, subsidize it. What are you subsidizing here? Unemployment. shiftlessness.
Right.
You will get more of it if you subsidize it. Ant's further analysis there, whether this is something we want to do, that's still an open question, but you will get fewer people working if everybody just gets a check in the mail every month.
There's an interesting side story to all of that, because we focus a lot on this question of, well, will people work less if we give them welfare, and that effect, I think, is less important than this other effect. And the other effect is how we go about doing that. For example, we have this plethora of welfare programs and tax codes that impact people. And when you add in all of these various welfare things, housing assistance and income assistance and food stamps and other stuff, and then taxes on top of that, you get this weird result, this weird interaction of these effects. And the weird interaction is, for the average family of 3, as this family increases their income from $0 to $10,000 to $20,000, their income, their take-home pay, rises a little bit less than you would think because of the taxes, right? But once you hit $20,000, something weird happens. And the weird thing is, we've designed some of these welfare programs to drop off. So if you earn $20,001, you get no heating allowance or whatever the thing is, right? These things drop off. So what happens is we create an actual poverty trap, such that if you're at $20,000 and you earn anything more than that, you actually end up worse off. Your take home, after all the dust settles of the benefits and the taxes, you're actually worse off, unless you can jump immediately from 20 to 40,000. Once you hit 40,000, you're now over that gap. And as you earn more, your take home ends up increasing. So what's happened is we just haven't thought this through correctly. What we've done is we've seen a problem and said, oh my God, government, fix this. And someone's gone and written some rule, and the rule isn't well thought out, and it interacts badly with other rules that already exist. And before you know it, we're actually unintentionally, but we're creating a situation that penalizes poor people for attempting to better themselves. And that's just not right.
Yeah, that jump from 20,000 to 40,000 is a really tough jump too, right? That's not the same jump as 100,000 to 120,000. That's a very, very difficult hurdle to cross. And indeed, most people faced with those circumstances are going to choose not even to try. And that's a rational choice, right? It's not laziness, it's not shiftlessness, it's rational. So we've got a question here, somewhat related, from Jeff Cintron, asking if we think that the current tax structure is regressive.
Yeah. So regressive, of course, means that people who earn more money effectively pay less taxes. And the question is, clearly the tax structure is not regressive. The tax structure is progressive. As you earn more money, you pay more money. Pay a larger percentage. But if you then include not just the taxes that the government takes, but also include transfers, money the government gives to people, right? And throw in there as well, welfare assistance, things like that. It's entirely, I haven't run the numbers, but it's entirely possible that when you do that, it does end up being regressive. And that leads to this problem that James and I are talking about, of this gap where you can't increase yourself beyond 20 without actually making yourself worse off.
Yeah, I think ultimately—
Steve Perry asked—
Well, yeah, we'll get to Steve in just a minute. But I think it's probably impossible to conclude that the tax structure writ large is regressive, right? The rich actually, when you look at receipts, the people who we refer to as the rich pay a lot more than everybody else. That doesn't mean that there aren't real systemic problems in the tax code. Clearly there are. And the further down you drill, so yeah, I'm talking now about the federal tax code, right? But when you start looking at other things like state income tax, it's a different animal entirely. And then when you get all the way down to sales taxes absolutely tattoo the poor in a way that they never touch the rich, right? We have a 6% sales tax here where I sit in in Utah, that's just not that big a deal to me unless I go to buy something round about the size of a car, right? But for people who are at the very low end of the economic spectrum here in Utah, there are certain items that they need for day-to-day living that are taxed. That 6% represents a deep hardship. And in that respect, some of the more local taxes are incredibly regressive when the federal taxes simply are not. So it's a big bag that we always talk about, and you have to separate things out a little more than that 30-second political soundbite would allow. So we throw these terms around a little bit, but in order to be fair with them, I think we have to always ask which taxes. What does regressive actually mean? The harder questions like this. But then we get to Steve Perry's question, which I think is a fantastic question. And it gets, I think, right to the heart of a lot of things that, Ant, you and I talk about on a very regular basis. And I'm just going to read it. It's wonderful. He says, the market is amoral. Do you think leaving economic forces to a free market actually encourages actions which ultimately result in unjust structures perpetuated by misuses of power? So he's asking a question about the morality of markets. And I think, Ant, you and I would probably heartily agree with him that markets are, in fact, amoral. So is that a problem?
Yeah.
Morality of markets. And I think...
Yeah.
That was weird.
I would say markets are amoral, and political structures are probably amoral also. The morality or the lack of morality doesn't come from the system. It comes from the people involved in the system. So if you put immoral people into a market environment, you will get immoral outcomes. If you put moral people into a market environment, you will get moral outcomes. The morality is not a function of the market, it's a function of the people. So if you're using policy and economics to try and fix a moral problem, you've got the wrong tool.
And I think it goes even a little further than this, and it gets to the heart of some of the things that Ant and I like to talk about when we travel around the country talking about these things. And ask yourself this: when a political system makes mistakes, how likely is that system to correct those mistakes? What are the motivations that the actors inside that system feel to fix the problems that they themselves have created? And the answer seems to be not much. It's very difficult to bring pressure to bear on political actors when they make decisions that don't actually work out the way they planned. And notice, I'm not saying that these people have terrible intentions. I'm not saying they're evil people. I'm just saying they're people, like the rest of us. All the same foibles that we all experience and exhibit. In a market, the motivation to fix a mistake is extreme, because the burden falls to you if you make a mistake. And think about how fast Coca-Cola came up with New Coke, and then how quickly they went back to original Coke once people took the first sip of New Coke, right? And you can think of product after product after product that failed in the market, and companies turned around and either righted the ship or went out of business. Well, Congress keeps ticking along no matter the mistakes they make. And the reason we all convened here tonight was to commemorate, in a way, a $20 trillion debt. Well, there's a lot of mistakes that led to a $20 trillion debt. Not only do they not get corrected over time, politicians double down on them, right? So it just keeps getting worse. And we presented a case early on where we actually think that in 10 years, we're going to have a $75 trillion debt, and that we probably won't be able to pay the interest on that anymore. Who will pay the price for that? And the obvious answer is all of us, when it finally comes home to roost. The politicians who built this problem from nothing to where it is, they won't pay. In a market, they would have paid dearly. And therein lies the difference for us. It's not that we think one group of people is better than another group of people, or that one kind of answer is better than another kind. We just think in markets, people are held accountable for the decisions that they make. And in politics, not so much.
James, that's about it. For those of you that are here, thank you for coming. You can reach me at antonydavies.org. Feel free to friend me on Facebook. James as well?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think we're all on Facebook, so it should be pretty easy to find me there, but I'm the only James Harrigan that looks like this. So if you look at the little picture, you'll find me, no problem. And I'd love to have you on board. My page has rather robust political discussion, economic discussion on a daily basis. Please stop on by.
So thank you all. Good night.
Thank you and good night.